name is Amy Terpstra, and I am with a research group out of Chicago called the Social Impact Research Center, and we're housed within a large nonprofit organization called Heartland Alliance for Human Needs and Human Rights. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about both of those entities in a few minutes. But to kick things off, I wanted to start off by telling you about a recent experience that I had with Mr. Eddie Vedder of Pearl Jam. I'm hoping that most folks in the room know who Pearl Jam is. Interestingly, when I told I'm the oldest of 5 children, and when I told my younger siblings that I was going to this concert, none of them knew who Pearl Jam was. So that was a shocker. It was the first time that one's happened to me. But so I want to set the context by telling you a little bit about my experience going to this concert. So I heard about the concert. It was actually in July. It was just last month. I heard about it probably in January earlier this year, and I heard about it in several different ways. I first of all heard it on the radio, or kind of like a promo for it. Like Pearl Jam's coming to Chicago. They're going to be playing at Wrigley Field, which I'm a White Sox fan, so that didn't really compel me. But nonetheless, who said that did that? Who did a little I guess I'm in Rocky's territory, but. I also heard about it through several emails that I got. I heard about it on Facebook. And interestingly, I heard a little story about it on NPR. So, I have to go. Like, this is an absolute must. It does not matter what I am doing this summer, what else I'm going to be doing in July, I must go to this concert. I'm very compelled by all of the hype about this concert. So I go online at 10 a.m., or probably like 9:45 on a Saturday morning in February, and I'm waiting very eagerly on the Ticketmaster website to get my tickets. 10 a.m. hits and I'm pushing the purchase button, purchase. And I keep getting like, we're so sorry, but the website is experiencing, an unprecedented amount of traffic right now. You're just gonna have to, please try again later. So I keep doing this, I do it for about 10 minutes, and finally I get a screen that looks different, and it says like, yay, you're now in a waiting room for your tickets. So I'm in this like online waiting room, which is like a online purgatory for ticket sales. I finally end up getting my tickets. I do get them. I get 6 of them. So my 6 tickets, they're $54 a ticket. So, if my math is correct, that adds up to about $324 if I get 6 tickets, right? I'm going to get the maximum of 6 tickets. No. Pearl Jam has different math, and Ticketmaster has different math skills than the rest of us. Let me tell you, if you've ever purchased any concert tickets, you know this. So my total bill comes to $420. So that's an extra $16 per ticket in added kind of fees and taxes, right? So I'm irritated, but it really seems reasonable for reliving my kind of teenage angst years for one night in July. Well, okay, fast forward. About 6 days before the concert, I have a very unfortunate bicycle accident involving my right foot, the flip-flops I was wearing, and the spokes of my bike. Use your imagination, it was that bad and it was worse than you're even thinking. So I can't walk pretty much at all for a few days. When the concert comes about, I'm kind of hobbling about. I probably still shouldn't have been walking. But one of the things about going to Wrigley Field is there's no parking. And so you pretty much have to take the L. So I take the L, and I'm almost crying by the time we get there, because I swear to you, every person on that train tried to step on my foot. And by the time I finally get to my seats in Wrigley Field, I am in that like one slice of the stadium in the evening where the sun is still beating on you. And it was 100 degrees that day. The mercury actually went 100 degrees, and it was like 95% humidity. And I don't know if you get that weather here, and according to my husband who lived in Colorado for 4 years, you don't, because it's like the land of milk and honey here, and everything's fabulous. It's true, right? Yeah. People don't disagree with that. But it was horrible. So we're sweating, and the whole evening had been labeled an evening with Pearl Jam, which sounds very, sophisticated. Like the concert might actually start on time. It didn't. It started 45 minutes late, so by the time the band begins to play, they play they're amazing. They start right in, it's fantastic. Everybody's really into it. They play for a grand total of 35 minutes. Oh my God. They wanted to keep playing, but severe storms were rolling in, and there was massive thunder and lightning. So they had to evacuate Wrigley Field. So I don't know if you've ever been there, but it's not like the nicest place in the world. So we had to wait out this storm in kind of the inner bowels of the stadium. So it's 100 degrees. You're with a bunch of other very sweaty, very wet because we got stuck in the rain, people. You're all confined like this. You can barely breathe. And we received absolutely no information about what was going to be happening. So we waited it out for 2.5 hours in those conditions without any word for if the concert's going to continue, if the concert is going to be canceled, if we're going to get our money back. Everybody knows that the curfew at Wrigley Field for playing a concert is 11 p.m. You can't play past 11. Well, a 2.5 hour rain delay pushes you past 11 p.m. So it's all very unclear. Well, long story short, Pearl Jam ends up making good kind of on their concert. We go back, we watch, they play for like another 3 hours. They played really long. So the concert goes to like over but after 2 in the morning. But me being me and having woken up at 4:30 that morning, I start falling asleep at about 1:30, and so my husband takes me home. Let me tell you this. Eddie Vedder should never be a PI, ever. If his concert were a research study, he would have broken every single rule in the books for human research, human subject protections, right? Consider my annoyances with my experience here. His advertising, his recruitment was delivered in these like short little bursts. They were designed to make me absolutely need to be there. Not only that I needed to be there, but that I needed to corral all of my friends to be there too and convince them that this was the best idea ever. I didn't even look at the date. I just knew it was happening in the summer and I was gonna be going. And then when I got into Ticketmaster, there seemed to me, although I'm sure there was in the back end in that whole crazy internet world, no orderly kind of fair way to distribute tickets. It seemed like I just got kind of the luck of the draw if I was gonna be involved in this concert or not. And then what I'm expected to give my money in return for getting that great concert experience is obviously not clearly spelled out to me. I thought I was gonna be paying $54 a ticket. That is just completely false. I was expected to pay quite a bit more than that in the long run for the tickets. And then the entire experience was obviously not tailored to somebody in my condition. Somebody who could barely walk, somebody who was very prone to sunburn, and not a night owl. The concert was obviously designed for kind of the average Joe, the average person, and with the storms, with where it was held, all of this stuff. And then the utter lack of information coming during the rain delay left us all scratching our heads and wondering what we had gotten ourselves into and how this was all going to be resolved. And then my participation in this concert, which I thought was going to be over by 11, quite frankly, and I'd be like nice in bed by 11:45, and I could get all my stuff done the next morning, ended up totally messing up not only that night, but my plans for the next day. So it's really easy to see the glaring mistakes in Eddie Vedder and his kind of concert planning folk and the mistakes that they made, which obviously in the context of a rock concert aren't actually mistakes, right? They're just annoyances to people who are a little bit grouchy and maybe a little bit, I don't know, too old or too something to be going to these types of concerts anymore. But the fact of the matter is that in informed consent, there aren't just mere annoyances, right? We have these situations, we talked about some of them this morning, we're gonna talk about some of them now and throughout the rest of the day that are kind of really bad or they're okay, or then there's these kind of gray areas, right? So the really bad things are the things that go against the regulations that we heard all about this morning. And we know these, and you can see them, you look at them and you say, oh my goodness, it's like not legal. Those are really bad things. And then we know, sometimes we can just design a really great informed consent procedure and form that kind of get 5 stars from the fine folk at the table back there. And they pass all the regs and they meet them with flying colors. And then there's all those gray areas. And so it's really the gray areas that I kind of want to focus on with you all here today. So what we're going to be doing in our time together this afternoon is a few what I'm calling quick work sessions. And so these are kind of rapid fire conversations that you're going to have with folks at your table or your next door neighbor there. They're going to be quick because we don't have all the time in the world, so we're not going to be able to delve super deeply, but I hope to just kind of get the conversation started. And so our first quick work session is something that I like to call hang your head in shame informed consent stories. So you might know that there's an old Bob Wills song by this name. The lyrics go, does your conscience ever bother you every time you hear my name? Think of all I've gone through and hang your head in shame. So we all have these moments, whether you want to admit them or not. We have been witness to them or we have been part of them ourselves. So these are the kind of informed consent situations that you cringe to remember, that you really would rather have just disappear from your memory and from kind of the world of existence. They might be instances where you're an IRB member and you've had a study been submitted to you and you've taken one look at it and you've said, what in the world are these people thinking? How can they even think that this is okay? Other times, you've done everything wonderfully. You crossed all of your T's and dotted all of your I's, and still somehow something manages to go wrong that you didn't anticipate, and that you think you might not have been able to anticipate. So we're going to share these stories with each other. There's going to be no judgment here, no penalty. This is just what I think of as good old-fashioned informed consent therapy, which is very important to do every once in a while. So I'm going to start by priming the pump here and telling you one of my hang your head in shame stories. So we were doing a study with supportive housing residents, and supportive housing is a model of housing for people who are either previously institutionalized or who are formerly homeless, who have a variety of forms of disability. So it's kind of an affordable housing, a subsidized housing option for them that also has wraparound services to help keep them housed. So we're doing a study, and we have kind of a stratified sampling approach, different housing developments throughout Illinois. We need a certain number of residents from each of them. And we have distributed recruitment materials to the different case managers at these housing developments saying, if you want to learn about this study, come talk to researchers who are going to be here on such and such a date at such and such a time. Come down to the common room and you can have some one-on-one time with the researchers to learn about this study. So the very first housing development that we go to, we arrive like an hour or an hour and a half early to start setting up for our recruitment and our informed consent procedure. And there's already 20 people waiting for us in the room, like an hour before the scheduled time. So this is fantastic. We thought we were going to have some problems recruiting for this study, but it's apparent that we don't. In fact, from this particular site, we only need 15 people, not 20. Well, that becomes a problem. Because once we start to realize that not only do we not know which 15 of those 20 people got there first, they don't know. And so a little fight kind of ensues with the people, like, no, I was here first, no, I was here first. And so we're, why does everyone want to be in this study? This is a little bit crazy. We're offering like something super measly, like $5 or $10 of McDonald's gift cards, to talk to us because we were just asking them for permission to access some medical records. And what became our solution was, well, to be fair, we're going to offer this little incentive to everybody who showed up today, since we obviously did a kind of a poor job of managing this. They weren't appeased. What it turned out was that these people were incredibly lonely. Nobody ever talks to them or comes to express any sort of interest in them. And they literally wanted to spend 20 minutes with another human being just talking to them, and they didn't care what it was about. And so we had to go back and completely rethink how we were doing this and create an approach that didn't make us feel so, quite frankly, disgusting when we got there and had to be turning people away. And in that particular instance, we ended up just spending 20 minutes with all 20 people because it was, obviously something that we hadn't anticipated and that we felt really badly about. So now that you all feel bad for me and how badly I treated those people, I wasn't the PI on that study. Share with your neighbors. Pick one or two of your neighbors and share your hang your head in shame informed consent stories. And we're going to come back together in 5 minutes. Ready? Go. Okay, I know that wasn't near enough time for true informed consent therapy. But let's come back together now. Does anyone have a particularly juicy informed consent hang your head in shame story that they'd be willing to share with the group? You can nominate your neighbors. Somebody's got to have one. I overheard little tidbits of them. You're going to let me be the only one who shares this with the whole group? They're all saying yes. All right, but you get the idea, right? This morning we talked about, and we covered the regulations, and so there's obviously legal considerations for why we need to be having really firmed up informed consent procedures and letting people know what they're getting into when they're coming into our studies. But I think as our stories probably illustrated, and as mine certainly did, even when you have your checklist completed when it comes to informed consent procedures and all the elements that you're supposed to include in your informed consent procedures and on your form, things can still go wrong. And when you get that feeling in the pit of your stomach, even though you know and technically you've done everything right, I think that obviously illustrates that a lot of we need to be paying a different kind of attention to our informed consent procedures. There's ethical considerations. A lot of us come from professions, or probably all of us, where there's a professional code of ethics, and that code of ethics kind of dictates how we approach every individual, every human being who we come across in our work, whether that's our colleagues or the people who are involved in our studies. We ascribe to human rights principles, many of us, that every individual, by virtue of being human, has an inherent dignity and worth, and that extends into every facet of life, including being part of a research study. And then we have, justice concerns. We talked about that a little bit this morning, of what it means when one group over another is more or less informed and then therefore more or less likely to be in research or to reap the benefits of research. So before we dissect all of that a little bit further, I want to tell you a little bit about Heartland Alliance and the Social Impact Research Center, because these are the two perspectives that I'm coming to this conversation with, which are perhaps a little bit unique, although I was interested to see, I think more so than the last one of these meetings that I was at, that there's a more 50-50 split here between kind of folks in the health field and folks in the more social sciences. So Heartland Alliance for Human Needs and Human Rights is the leading anti-poverty organization in the Midwest. We do all sorts of different types of work. We do work related to housing, homelessness, healthcare, especially healthcare for people who are experiencing homelessness. We do a lot of work around workforce development and jobs. We do a lot of justice-related work. We have a whole kind of legal team that especially focuses on immigrant rights and refugees, asylees, and human trafficking. So we're a very diverse organization. We are very large. We employ probably over 1,500 people, which is in the world of nonprofits big. We have programs in countries all over the world, probably about 30 different countries. We run hundreds of different programs. One of the hallmarks of our work is that our programs tend to be, again in the context of human services, rather innovative and cutting edge. We're a rare nonprofit that is kind of willing to try out new things, and if you're part of the nonprofit and human services world, you know that often our funding streams and kind of the requirements and restrictions that are put on us don't actually always encourage innovation and trying new and different things, but Heartland kind of has a philosophy that does that. We also serve a very, very disadvantaged population. So we work with a lot of people who fall through the cracks of other systems and other organizations, who don't meet the eligibility criteria for other types of programs, and we work with these people in a variety of our programs. So what that means in the context of today is that researchers want to come to Heartland to perform studies and to look at the programs that we're running and to examine the populations that we're working with. So Heartland hasn't always been this big. We've been around for 125 years, but really the last kind of 10 to 15 have been our period of large growth. And so in those last 10 to 15 years, we really started to notice an influx of researchers coming in and saying, we want to do the study, we want to do the study, we want to do the study. So it became very apparent pretty quickly that as an organization, we needed to get a grip on this. Because we needed to protect our participants in our programs, we needed to protect our staff, our programs, and the organization itself from the risks that are inherent in research, especially in our healthcare division. So we, for a while, had a policy where if you were to come into our organization, we would say that you had to have IRB approval from your sponsoring institution. But what we found out after doing that for a while was that other IRBs didn't quite have the same understanding of our population and our program and of the realities and the context that we were dealing with. They were approving things, studies and methods, and informed consent procedures that we simply weren't comfortable with. And so it became apparent that we needed to institute our own IRB, and we did that in 2004. if you want to talk about therapy, if you want to talk about the challenges of running an IRB and having it adequately staffed and adequately funded, we can have a side conversation about that, because that could take all afternoon. So it's been a real challenge for us, and it continues to be an ongoing challenge. And I'm not on our IRB and I don't run it. But I have been part of those conversations about how it could perhaps be differently structured. But the fact remains that it's very important for us to have our own institutional review board for the reasons that I outlined. Now, the other hat that I wear is with our Social Impact Research Center. And this is just one of Heartland's many different programs. We've been around for, 30 years now? 20 years? Whatever, I'm a researcher, my math should be better. But we've been around since the late 80s. And we were really developed to study many of the issues that Heartland was working on. And so we are an applied research center. We work with Heartland's own programs, but more often than not, we work with other nonprofits. We work with governments, we work with funders, we work with coalitions to really help them understand the population that they're serving better, to help them understand the social problems that they're working on better, and to help them understand if what they're doing is at all effective and how they can improve it. So the people that we work with want really kind of actionable results. They want things that they can look at and make improvements to the work that they're doing. And so as part of that work, obviously, we're designing studies, and we go through Heartland Alliance's own IRB, in addition to any others at any other organization that we're doing research at, which doesn't happen really that frequently, because there's not too many nonprofits out there that really have IRBs. All right, here's a pop quiz to see if you were listening this morning. What are the 3 official vulnerable populations according to the regulations? Oh, yay. You guys all get 3 stars. So we have representing pregnant women and fetuses. We have the famous Kate Middleton here, obviously from a few months ago. We have in the corner over here kids, I think they're from Detroit, the photo that was kind of made famous and went viral after the Trayvon Martin verdict came down. And then representing prisoners, we have a lovable Otis from the Andy Griffith Show, who, interesting side note, apparently the actor who played him never touched a drop of alcohol in his life. He had a really, really good drunk though, didn't he? So the reasons are fairly obvious. We touched on them a bit this morning of why these 3 populations are considered the official vulnerable populations, and why special consideration needs to be had when they're involved in research and when we're designing our informed consent procedures. But our hang your head in shame stories illustrated that there are plenty of other populations and groups that we need to be considering, we need to actually have special considerations for, even if the regs don't require them. So in light of that, I want to encourage us to move beyond subparts B, C, and D. Those are what I call, or maybe they are officially called, the official vulnerable populations. So I want to have us take it a step further, and I want us to think about populations with vulnerabilities. Or, because this is the age of text messaging and Twitter, we can shorten that to P's with V's. So we're going to call them P's with V's. Populations with vulnerabilities. They're not the official 3, but they are certainly have their own vulnerabilities. Now, as a picture up here, it might indicate I'm a runner, and so I think of informed consent with populations with vulnerabilities as being a little bit like runners. So if you're a runner, you know that there are kind of a whole set of guidelines and tips, tricks, kind of best practices, or research shows that this works best type of things that you're supposed to follow in order to kind of maximize your running, right? So this is things all the way from, like don't wear new shoes on the day of your marathon. The common sense stuff like that, all the way to stuff, like about incorporating speed work into your training 2 times a week in order to try and improve your time. And there's kind of a whole host of research shows best type things that we're all supposed to follow. But every runner is individual. Every runner has certain things that work better for them than for you. So, I might have a stomach of steel. Maybe I can eat whatever I darn well please before I go out there and run 20 miles. But you maybe, it took you 4 months to get your stomach to even accept a banana before you went out to run. So there's all sorts of individual differences. So while there's all these nice kind of guidelines that, kind of fit the average person, you need to figure out what works best for you in order to maximize your running experience and in order to improve as best you can. So I make my research team apply that notion to developing our informed consent procedures. And what we do, there's nothing like totally rocket science about this, is we literally sit down in a room together and we have the person who's leading the study describe the study, and then we just sit around and try and poke holes in their informed consent procedure and understand what makes the people who are in the study particularly vulnerable, potentially vulnerable, and how do each element of the informed consent process and procedure need to be tailored to minimize their potential vulnerability and maximize their comprehension of what they're getting into, and minimizing kind of all the risk and everything like that that's associated with the study. And while, again, it's not rocket science to do this, the fact that we intentionally carve out the time to have those conversations as a team has dramatically changed the way that we've done many of our informed consent procedures. I have never had an instance where we have walked away from the table intending to go about things the exact same way as when we came to the table. We always learn something, we always have a new insight. I want to share with you some of the P's with B's that Heartland Alliance works with and that we engage in our research studies very often. I give you 3 of them already. We work a lot with refugees and asylees, detained minors, people who are experiencing homelessness, people who are very poor, pregnant parenting teens. Heartland runs programs, street outreach and prevention programs, as well as treatment programs for HIV/AIDS. Unaccompanied homeless youth, foster youth, system-involved families, whether that's with the child welfare system, criminal justice system, or just kind of the public benefits systems. We work with domestic violence survivors and sex trade survivors, victims of human trafficking, public housing residents and food pantry clients, as your examples illustrated. As my example earlier illustrated, supportive housing residents, LGBTQ populations, injection drug users, people or elderly. The list goes on, and you can probably add to this list from your experiences as well, populations who have vulnerabilities and maybe not the same traditional ways we're used to thinking about it. But why is that? What makes these P's have B's, right? What makes these populations have vulnerabilities? Well, there's a few different reasons, and we could again add to this list. But first of all, a lot of folks that we work with have very desperate financial situations, and anybody who is in a desperate financial situation, is going to be vulnerable and is going to perhaps be much more susceptible to things that we don't consider coercive or even undue influence, but perhaps by the very nature of being in the study and receiving even a couple bucks to be in it, that might be undue influence for those populations. Anybody who's experienced past trauma. So some of those refugee and asylee populations, different victims of human trafficking, other populations, there are so many concerns that we have about engaging those folks in our research process, no matter what the research is. It also kind of goes with the next one, the history and dynamics with authority. So a lot of times, kind of by virtue of who we are and what we represent, we are exerting undue influence whether we want to or not, because we are perceived as an authority figure coming in as researchers and as representatives of some form of an institution. So in the case of the public housing example, oftentimes those folks they've had a lot of run-ins with the authority at the public housing site, and by as part of doing the study, we're like an extension of that housing authority to some degree, or at least in their eyes. And so there's all of these dynamics that happen with that, with trying to help people understand what we are and what we aren't, and where the lines are drawn between what information that we're collecting goes to the housing authority, what doesn't, whether it's identifiable or not. Being overstudied is a big one for us. I especially think about this in the context of welfare recipients. Do you know how many studies welfare recipients have been in? It's ridiculous. And so I think any population that's been overstudied has a vulnerability that we need to be considering. It might take the form of, you come and you say, hey, you want to be in this study? Let me tell you about this study. And there's like, yeah, I've been through this a million times. Let me just sign that form. I know the drill. Are they really informed? No, they're not really informed. And so there's that consideration, and probably others that we could talk about as well. People who are engaged in deviant behavior or are part of a stigmatized group. So often we run into this when we're working in studies with like transgender people, when there's kind of a dynamic there, or people are doing things that they might not want to be put onto paper. We had a couple examples of that this morning. More commonly, we have things like really low literacy, and probably everybody in this room runs into some of these barriers, or people who are non-English speaking, people who have cognitive impairments. Cultural differences are a really big one. So even if people are speaking English and you feel confident that you're able to communicate with them effectively with verbal or written word, how people make decisions varies from culture to culture, and you really need to be considering these things. Sometimes, certain cultural groups don't make decisions individually or don't value individual decision making. It's more of a group or a family decision. The time frame for decision making varies from culture to culture, so whether it can happen on the spot in the moment or whether it needs to kind of germinate and take root a little bit in order to come and make a decision about being in a study or not. So these are all things that I encourage my team certainly to think about. And they're really, really common for us. And I think that they're probably more common for you in the studies that you're doing or that you're reviewing than maybe you're even thinking. So I want to share with you a little bit some of the stuff that I pulled together that kind of shows the scope of some of these vulnerabilities and how really common they are. So consider some of this. 900 to 100,000 refugees and asylees are admitted to the US each year. And the top countries of origin are Iraq, Burma, Bhutan, Somalia, Cuba, Iran. There are about 634,000 people experiencing street homelessness or shelter homelessness on any given night in the United States. Now, that's kind of the official definition of homelessness. If you add in people who are living doubled up, who are kind of couch surfing, who don't have a place of their own, that's an additional 6 million people. Over 22 million people in this country are immigrants, many of whom are undocumented. So obviously that's going to present a vulnerability in terms of willingness to be part of research and understanding the informed consent process. 26% of Americans age 18 and older, so that's about 1 in 4 adults, suffer from a diagnosable mental disorder in a given year. So if you apply that to the US population, it's close to 60 million people. About 6% suffer from a serious mental illness. And then approximately 7.7 million Americans, adults, have PTSD. And then we're just talking about kind of cultural differences. Well over 1/3 of the US population is something other than white non-Latino. So that's around 115 million people. There are 48 million people in this country who are officially poor by the federal government's definition. And that definition is $18,000 a year for a family of 3. So that's obviously a pretty inadequate definition. So if you add in people who kind of fall below the poverty line at twice the poverty line, you have an additional 107 million people who are low income. 25 million people in the US speak English less than very well. About 6% of the population, 12% of the population over age 25 didn't finish high school. And then 63 million people in the US have just basic literacy skills, and an additional 30 million have below basic literacy skills. That's 43% of the American population with very poor or low literacy. So the scope of these vulnerabilities that we're talking about is actually really, really large. The odds of having somebody with one of these vulnerabilities or multiple ones of them in your study are pretty high, even if your studies are not designed to intentionally reach that particular population. The odds of you drawing in some folks with really low literacy skills are quite high. So these vulnerabilities, they seem to be roadblocks. Kind of we are reasonable people. We can apply kind of our reasonable thinking skills and say, yeah, I can see kind of how these vulnerabilities might present roadblocks to informed consent. But what does the research really say about all of this? What does the research say about our informed consent procedures and how wonderful they are, how bad they are? Well, the fact of the matter is that the research doesn't say much. We are really, really, really good at researching other things and other people. We are really, really bad at being research participants ourselves or examining our own methods. We are very bad at role reversal. But everything that I could find on this topic, most of it related to health literacy and how that impacts people's understanding of kind of the treatment that they're getting into. So there's some lessons that we can learn from that, certainly. And then the other kind of most common information, research about this related to people with cognitive impairments. But there wasn't much kind of about some of these other vulnerabilities that we've been talking about. But I was able to kind of pull together some information, some studies that I think might hold some interest for our conversation. So I want to share a few of these with you. In the Journal of Empirical Research on Human Research Ethics, Quinn and colleagues conducted surveys with researchers about their informed consent strategies, and then also with minority community members to understand their preferences for the informed consent process. So the researcher findings, they found that 78% of researchers usually go over the informed consent forms one-on-one with people, which is good. 77% allow information to be taken home. 65% have someone read the form out loud. 63% allow a family member of the research participant to be present. 59% allow for more than one meeting. 42% facilitate small group discussions with multiple participants learning about the study. 27% allow potential participants to talk to current participants in the study. And then it kind of goes down, drops off dramatically from there. And interestingly, nearly all of the researchers in the study report using plain language in forms, which the researchers of this study actually kind of called out and said, that's probably not true, because all the other research shows that informed consent forms are actually pretty terrible, and they don't use plain language. Now, disturbingly, 32% of researchers reported that they did not do anything to assess understanding. That's probably underreported, right? And 25% report using just one of those methods that I mentioned to assess comprehension. Or I didn't actually mention them, but use only 25%, or 25% use only one method to assess comprehension. Now the community member findings were interesting. 85% of the community members understood that their signature on a consent form means that they understand and agree to participate. So that's good, but we're missing 15%. Between 56 and 62%, depending on the ethnic and racial group, believe that their signature meant that they could not sue the institution. And then only 52 to about 60-something% thought that the form meant that they were protected as research participants. So there's a huge gap there in what people were understanding the informed consent form that they assigned to mean. And when it came to the community members' preference for an informed consent procedure, their top two were the ones that the researchers were doing, which was going over the forms one-on-one with them and allowing information to be taken home. But community members, kind of a close third and fourth in terms of their preference, they wanted to have more than one meeting with the research team. They wanted to be able to kind of think about things and then come back with additional questions and have things explained to them again. And they really wanted to talk to other people who were in the study. That was a preferred method, and that was one that the researchers who were also in the study reported doing far less. Another study in the New England Journal of Medicine, the researchers, I like this one, I don't like it because it's bad, but they looked at US medical schools, and they found that the IRB provided text that they provided on their websites for informed consent forms, they were on average nearly 3 grade levels above the IRB's own standards for readability. So they were written at a 10.6 grade level. And there was absolutely no correlation between the literacy rates of the intended target population and the readability of those forms and the language that the IRB provided. Now this maybe can make OHRP feel a little bit better. Among the institutions that were made subject to federal oversight, those forms were a little bit more readable than the ones that weren't, although not by much. It was a 10.2% grade level compared to a 10.9. So there's a bit of a disconnect, right, between what some of these IRBs are saying is plain language and readability versus what they're even providing on their own websites as examples for researchers to follow. Another study in the Journal of General Internal Medicine, the researchers there tested an informed consent form that was written at a 6th grade reading level. They did this with an ethnically diverse population, mostly over the age of 50. And about 40% of those folks had limited literacy, which is about kind of the prevalence rate of low literacy in the general population. And this is interesting. They read people the consent form, and then they asked a series of questions related to various sections of the form to assess their comprehension. Only 28% of participants answered all the comprehension questions correctly the first time. 28%. When they went through it again, kind of after the second pass, 80% answered all the questions correctly. And then they implemented a teach to goal strategy where they would go over the sections that they got wrong, kind of really, until they got it. Once they did that, they were able to get 98% of people to answer all of the questions correctly, the comprehension questions. There was an article written by Florian Emanuel in the Journal of American Medical Association. They examined previous studies on informed consent, and once they kind of winnowed it down to studies that met their criteria, I think they only came up with like 6 that had actually studied informed consent procedures very directly and in the manner in which they were interested in. But what they found, they were able to draw some interesting conclusions. They concluded that multimedia doesn't really seem to help too much in terms of fostering better comprehension in the informed consent procedure. So this would be something like showing people a video or having them do something on a computer. It didn't really help their immediate comprehension, but what it did help was their recall about a week later. They were able to better recall the process and what the different elements and the different details of the study. They also found that an enhanced informed consent form, one that's been written at a lower reading level, that's formatted really nice, all of those good things, in and of itself does not help comprehension. It helps when it's combined with some of the other methods, one-on-one interaction, a lot of room for discussion and other things, but the form in and of itself isn't the end-all be-all. As we all know, it's been drilled into our heads, informed consent's a process, not a piece of paper. And then again, they found that the most effective tactic for increasing informed consent is one-on-one conversations, which I know a lot of us feel isn't always feasible time-wise, money-wise, but it by far is the most effective tactic for increasing comprehension. The last one that I'll mention is a study done on welfare recipients in Florida a number of years ago. But within this study, they also kind of tested comprehension of the informed consent process and reported on it. And what they found was that there was a significant correlation between people being able to comprehend information and where that information was placed on the informed consent form. So they were much better able to recall things in the first third of the form than in the second third or the last third. People barely remembered anything from the last third of the form. There's obviously some very interesting kind of conclusions that we might be able to draw and lessons to be learned for our informed consent procedures from some of these findings, and I want to hit on them in just a few minutes. But first, I want you to get back to some quick work here. You've heard me talk for long enough in one big chunk. Who recognizes the equation? I wouldn't know. It's Pearson's chi-square. So this is, goodness of fit is a concept that a lot of researchers, statisticians are familiar with. It's this notion of kind of how well our statistical model fits a set of observations. And often statisticians are kind of, pretty obsessed with this. And when it comes to which tests to run on which sets of data. Why is it, I always ask my team, and I think I'm asking us here today, why is it that we design our informed consent procedures to fit the average person? Just like Eddie Vedder designed his concert to fit the average concert goer, not people like me. Why is it that we are not considering goodness of fit in our informed consent procedures? We're only considering it in our statistical models and maybe in our research design. Our informed consent procedure needs to be just as deliberately thought about in each and every bit of it. So we all, heard a good review of the basic elements of informed consent this morning. So what I want us to do in the next couple of minutes is turn to the second page of your worksheet. And for the same group that you worked on in quick work number 2. So whether it was the domestic violence situation, the food pantry client, the public housing residents, I want you to try and strive for goodness of fit for each element of the informed consent procedure for that population. Don't go deep, you're only going to have a couple minutes, but continue the conversation you were having before and talk about how you might consider that population, their vulnerabilities in each and every kind of one of these little elements of informed consent. How would you modify things? What might you need to be thinking of? What would some of your considerations or concerns be? So take another about 5 to 7 minutes to do that, and we'll regroup then. Okay, I'm sure that you weren't able to have the most thorough discussion, but I hope that this at least kind of got your wheels turning about a goodness of fit of an informed consent procedure for populations who are not officially vulnerable, but who have vulnerabilities that we might want to be considering in the research process. The next thing that I was going to have us do, but I think in the interest of time, I'll just mention it. Is this notion of functional minimalism. And I am applying this notion to specifically our informed consent forms. Now, I mentioned that some studies have shown that the form alone, and we all know this, is not enough. But if you have a really crappy form, odds are nothing else in your informed consent procedure process is going to go well. So I would just encourage you to think about developing informed consent procedures, whether you are a PI, whether you're the IRB, and you're putting out examples, along the lines of functional minimalism. So look at these two pictures of living rooms. Right? Now, they both contain the same things. They both have a couch. They both have some pillows. They both have a fireplace, some lighting, pictures. I find it very difficult to make out what the heck is happening in this one on the left versus the one on the right, which I take one look at and I can very easily understand that it's a living room. I literally have to look at this other one for a few minutes. Is it a bedroom? Is it a palace? Is it a, what is it?
You're making fun of my parents.
I'm making fun of my parents too. It's true. I don't care how you design your home, but I do care how you design your form. Strive for the nice, slick, clean, functional, minimalist living room when you're designing your informed consent forms. If you turn to the third sheet, we're not going to do this exercise, but what I've done is given you a little blurb from informed consent form. And it's written at a college level. And so what I would encourage you maybe to do later on, just for fun, is to rewrite that and try and get it to a lower reading level. And I'll kind of ruin the fun for you here. You can read what it says. It says, you voluntarily consent to participate in this research investigation. You may refuse to participate in this investigation or withdraw your consent and discontinue participation in the study without penalty, without affecting your future services or your ability to receive alternative services. How many of us have written something like that or put that in our consent forms?
Every medical consent form has this and more.
That and way, way, way more, right? So if I were to rewrite that at a 4th grade reading level, here's what it would sound like. Participation in this study is entirely voluntary. You have the right to leave the study at any time. Leaving the study will not result in any penalty. Oh, I'm sorry, that's the 8th grade. Will not result in any penalty or loss of benefits or services to which you are entitled. So we get a little bit better there. Now, the 4th grade reading level. You don't have to be in this research study. You can agree to be in the study now and change your mind later. Your decision will not affect your regular services. Your case manager's attitude toward you will not change. All 3 of those are getting across the exact same information. Why is that first one big, long, complex sentence, and this other one is 5 nice, short sentences that get across the exact same information? So think functional minimalism. There's some resources that I'll share with you at the end where you can kind of go to get some of these exercises and examples of how to modify some of your written language so that it's more like the living room on the right. So I'd like to share, to wrap things up here, some strategies for informed consent with P's with V's, or what I like to call don't be an Eddie Vedder. And these are going to be some strategies in particular for PIs, but I think that there's some lessons here too for IRBs and folks that are overseeing research processes. So the first one builds on this functional minimalism idea. Less is more, right? That's that equation at the top left. We need to cover all of our elements of informed consent. We need to check off all the boxes in our informed consent checklist, but we also need to make sure that they're readable, that they're logically organized, that the font size doesn't require a magnifying glass to read. Just because your informed consent form is 3 pages doesn't mean that you've done something amazing. Make it readable. Make it logically organized, make it flow, have there be some white space on the page. Again, studies are mixed on how effective a good form is as a standalone, but it's a place to start. Start there, make it good. Good things will flow from your good form. If you really can't, if your hands are tied by the bureaucracy that is, consider actually, work with me here for a minute, adding to each section of the form a simple summary statement that's written very plainly. So you can appease the powers that be by having their technical jargon and their awful language, but in each section you have a very simple statement that summarizes things and has it in language that people don't have to read 7 times to understand. Maybe they can read the paragraph once and understand what it's telling them. The second tip here is to not be an American tourist. What is the stereotypical American tourist? Well, it's like these poor 2 people, and maybe again I'm making fun of somebody's parents, or some of us. But you know, the stereotypical American tourist goes to another country and they assume that everything's going to be just like at home. They want their favorite restaurants. They assume that everyone's going to communicate in the same way and act towards them in the same way and make decisions the same way. Don't do this as a researcher. Be a savvy world traveler as a researcher. Sometimes this means really digging deep into who the population in your study is going to be and understanding that population. Now, some of us work with the same population, and it might be a population with vulnerabilities, and we work with them, and we've worked with them for years, and so we have this good understanding. But for those of us who are going in new, or if you just want to kind of check yourself a little bit, take that step back and say, what do I know about this population? What do I need to learn? How can I learn it? Is there some kind of formative study that you can do? Who can you be talking to better understand what needs to happen in terms of how people prefer to be communicated to, how people make decisions, what to do, what not to do, what are some of the different faux pas you want to avoid, look at best practices, and cover all the elements of informed consent with this notion of goodness to fit for the population. Now the one down here in the corner, I don't know if you can see it very well, but it's kind of an if-then scenario. I like to do this with my team. We design our informed consent procedures, but then we go through a number of if-then scenarios, because it always happens. We get somebody who comes in the door and we sit down to do informed consent with them and they only speak like Hindi or something. And so we need to understand what is the protocol in that situation. When do we go to find a translator, or when do we say, you know what? You can't be in this study. You just don't meet the criteria. We can't adequately talk to you about this study. And we worry that because of that barrier, you're not going to be fully informed. And so we think it's best if we part ways here. And there's all sorts of different if-then scenarios that you can develop that make your team feel really good about their decision-making abilities in the field, and the kind of empowering them to make those decisions kind of in the moment. Now, the other thing that we like to do is sit around and brainstorm. We do a lot of sitting around and brainstorming. Kind of who is the most likely vulnerable group to be, or the most vulnerable group to likely be in our study. And then we design our informed consent procedures around that person. And so we are focusing in, we're hypothesizing who is going to present the most trouble for our informed consent procedure, who we need to be most sensitive to. And if we design our informed consent procedure to meet that group's needs, the odds are it's going to fit most everybody else's needs as well. And so that's been a rather valuable exercise for us to go through as well. The other thing that I'd encourage you to do here is not just to think if-then, but then post-informed consent procedure or post-study, reflect back on what happened. So when we did this, this happened. When we did that, this happened. And have that inform your future work. Again, a lot of us do this, and we do this kind of intuitively, but to actually take that step back with your team who is actually conducting informed consent is a really good thing to do. I know it takes time out of busy people's schedules, but to have that debrief, not just about how the study went, but about how the informed consent procedure went, is a really great, valuable learning experience. Exercise, train your staff. I think a lot of researchers and a lot of research entities train their staff kind of when they come in, when they're new staff. We train our staff on informed consent procedures, every single study, and we continue to do it even when people get irritated and say, I've sat through this training a million times. We say it's not the same training. It's not the same study. It's not the same population. It's not the same informed consent procedures. So you need to train everybody together, do a lot of role playing. There's so many different ways you can go about this, but it's very easy, I think, to overlook this when you're kind of doing the same studies, kind of doing replication, doing things pretty similarly. But I would encourage you to never overlook this element of training. So the next picture, I was telling some folks at lunch, this time last week I was actually hiking up from the bottom of the Grand Canyon. Which is awesome. You guys should all, if you are physically able, to go hike the Grand Canyon. It was a wonderful experience. So we've been planning this trip for like a year. And so, I had this idea that, it might be a little bit difficult and I should train for this. Now, I mentioned that I'm a runner and I'm an endurance runner, so I kind of felt pretty confident about my ability to handle this hike. But you don't run with, like 20 pounds of water and other gear strapped to your back. So, in Chicago, if you've ever been there, it looks like this. It's very, very flat. And so obviously you're going to be going up like an inverted mountain when you're climbing up from the bottom of the Grand Canyon. So this picture down here, the green picture, is me training. That's me training. So I strapped 5 liters of water onto myself, packed my pack up, and I went hiking in May in northern Michigan. So let me tell you about how well that training prepared me for the hike. Not one bit. Not even 1%. It did not help at all. The conditions were vastly, vastly different, obviously, in Grand Canyon than in northern Michigan in May. Obviously, lesson learned here, test your informed consent procedures with the people who are going to be in your study. Don't just test them on each other. Don't just test them on your interns, your students. Actually find some people who are like the people who are going to be in your study and test your informed consent procedures on them. Otherwise, you are going to be training for something or testing for something on different people, and it's going to be like my Grand Canyon experience. Absolutely, utterly different and kind of laughable, very laughable, that I thought that this would train me. Who remembers reading Rainbow? Yes. We read all of our consent forms out loud to every single participant. We don't even give a choice. And this reduces stigma, because anytime you ask somebody, do you want me to read this consent form to you, what they hear from you is, you dummy, you probably don't know how to read. And so we don't even give an option. It is standard procedure for us to read through everything. And reading is kind of I almost don't even want to say, because we don't consider reading the consent form true informed consent. We view informed consent not just as a process, but as a conversation. And so we really try and have it be as much talking on their part as it is on our part. So in informed consent, we do an awful lot of talking as the researchers and as people who are administering informed consent. But we want, and we strive for like a 50-50 balance in the conversation, because that's a real conversation, right? Having the people on the other side of the table talking as much and asking as many questions and telling you the things back that they're hearing from you. The next one there is a delightful picture of 2 girls jumping in a lake, and I like to call this one jumping in together. And what I really mean by this one is that I feel as though we should strive to eliminate kind of the hierarchy and the authoritative nature that is inherent sometimes in our informed consent procedures and in research in general. We talked a little bit before about people's history with authority and authority figures and what that might mean as researchers. One of my biggest pet peeves and something that I really strive hard to do is not call people involved in research subjects. Language matters. It matters a lot. So if you've noticed, I refer to everybody involved in research as participants. They are as much a participant as I am in the research project. And so by virtue of using different language, I know it sounds kind of like fluffy and very social worky, and I am a social worker, but I think that really actually does matter, and it communicates something to the people who are involved in the research about their value and their role in the research. The other thing, there's very kind of little things that we like to do. We never sit across a table from people who were going through informed consent, where we sit next to them, we go over things together. There's all sorts of little things that can kind of create a more equal feel between the participant and the person who's administering informed consent that sends kind of subconscious messages or unconscious messages to the person about their value in this entire process as well. And then Facebook. What do I mean by that? I do not mean to take all of your research onto Facebook. What does Facebook kind of represent? It represents sharing, right? Or oversharing if you're my Facebook friends. I mean two things by this. The first is to share with the research participants themselves. Give them things to take home. I think probably a lot of you do this. You give them a copy of the form. You need to do that. But also consider kind of developing supplementary materials that aren't 50 pages long or 12 pages long and aren't written in legalese. Try to create things that are a little bit more user-friendly. You can give that all to folks to take home. Share that with them. The other thing I want to encourage us to do is have more of these conversations. We need to be sharing with each other. If we're not talking about how we're handling the different scenarios and we're handling informed consent, we're not sharing our hang your head in shame stories, we're never going to get better at this. And we are never going to find better ways to do things if we're not sharing them with each other. And I think that the IRBs actually have a role to play in that as well, which I want to hit on. Be a model if you're an IRB or an institution hosting research, right? Put things on your website. Put good things on your website that conform to your own standards, especially when it comes to readability. Help people out a little bit. Put out some examples so that people aren't floundering, so that you can help people understand what the expectations are around informed consent, not just the forms, but also the process. Offer some tips. So, for those things that are kind of the gray areas, that are, populations with vulnerabilities, offer some new ideas for ways of doing things, like some of the ones that we've been talking about here today. That top one up there, has anyone seen that movie? I can't remember what it's called. It's a delightful movie. The Moonrise Kingdom or something. Yes, it's a delightful movie. These two kids are exploring. As the IRBs, I feel like we should be encouraging exploration of ways to do informed consent that still meet all the regulations, but that we can test out some of these ways of doing informed consent to see if they help with comprehension, if they help with actually making people truly informed, understanding what they're getting into. So to encourage researchers to build in kind of side studies to their study, do their study, the primary study, but also kind of assess some of the informed consent procedures. I don't think we do enough of that, as kind of my scan of the literature revealed. There's actually very few studies that have really looked intentionally at the informed consent process with especially vulnerable populations and how people are comprehending their role in research. Now the last one over there, you'll recognize that from Apple's commercials. We have the PC guy here on the left, and then we have the cool Mac guy over here on the right. What I encourage you with this one to think about is getting some street smarts on your institutional review board. So we all have the guys in the suits, right? We all have kind of the academics, the people who are really good thinkers around these issues and who are very smart about research and even smart about informed consent. What we do at Heartland is we often use that kind of flexibility in the regulations about getting an expert on your board who's not like a non-voting person. We consider impacted populations to be experts. So we'll bring in impact. If we're doing a study with people who are homeless, we might bring in a couple people who are homeless or a representative so that they can be part of that conversation and they can lend a firsthand perspective on how the study itself is perceived and also how they feel that the informed consent procedures might kind of go over, so to speak. And so we do this really frequently, and it's really valuable to do. It's one thing to get in an expert who knows about the impacted population, that's good, but I think it's even better to get the true experts, the people who are actually impacted. That's great. It actually leads into kind of the last couple slides that I have for you, which is in honor of Pearl Jam's iconic 10 album. 10 resources here for you. And so if you have the slides, it provides some links here and some non-properly written citations, which was very freeing to write non-proper citations. But some of the studies that I referenced are here in addition to some others. And I would imagine, if I can speak for Michelle, if you have other resources that you think might be good, like the ones you're talking about that might be coming out soon, if you're able to kind of get those to Michelle, I'm sure she kind of has a listserv for this group, and if it's of interest and if you think it's really valuable to add to some of the stuff we've been talking about today, you can email them to me or to Michelle, and we can kind of hopefully get them out to folks.